Good evening or good morning, depending on where are you on the planet. So welcome to the third edition of the Political Communication Network Satellite at NetSci. This year will be a quite short workshop because of the Zoom fatigue we all are experiencing. We decide to keep it short, but despite that, we have a fantastic lineup of keynotes and invited speakers. So as I told you before, unfortunately, Camille Roth will not be with us in person since he is late with their planes, and he is not able to be here. But we have his video presentation. And now, so we have 3 keynotes presentation, then a small break, and then another one, the video presentation by Camille, and a panel discussion after the break. And the first one to present will be Alberto Acerbi. He is a researcher in the field of cultural evolution, and he's working at the interface of psychology, anthropology, and sociology. And he uses evolutionary approach with different methodology to study digital culture. He is also the author of a very inspiring book, Cultural Evolution in the Digital Age. And it's really a pleasure for us to have you here, Alberto, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing the screen, so we're sure that everything works. Yeah. Can you see my slides?
Yes, perfectly.
That's perfect. Yes, thank you very much to the organizers for having invited me here, even if I am in my living room in Bristol, but it's still a pleasure to be here. And what I will present today, as you see, is I have a kind of provocative title, but I hope at least to put on the table some food for thoughts about research on online misinformation. So, as everybody knows, online misinformation is and has been a hot topic in research, in media in the past years. You can see here some examples from newspaper covers or articles from different countries, but of course you can find thousands of them. That's a documentary that was out a few years ago that had quite success and presented a particularly strong view about the influence of social media on political events like Brexit, and I found it quite interesting. I will say something more about it quickly toward the end of my talk. Interestingly, the idea that online misinformation is a big threat is more or less accepted by all the political part. This is a few weeks ago, in the same week, there was at the same time like a speech, I think in Stanford, from Barack Obama that was talking about the danger of online misinformation for democracy and about the responsibility of tech platforms. And at the same time, a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, which is more on the center-right side, if you want, was basically saying the same thing for a piece in the Atlantic that had a lot of, generated a lot of discussion, of course, in social media again. The WHO, the World Health Organization, from the very beginning of the actual pandemic of coronavirus, started to talk about a parallel infodemic, which was, according to some documents, as dangerous as the real pandemic, and there was a lot of actions to fight and understand this infodemic, and also the term infodemic got extremely popular in academic papers in the last couple of years. And of course, this has an effect on the kind of activity that we as researchers do, and the kind of research that is founded. This is document from the website of the European Commission is from a few years ago, but you can find similar thing now, in which the idea is that as fake news proliferate, disinformation threatens democracy and efficient governance, and there is empirical evidence that false news are spreading significantly faster, deeper, and more broadly, etc., etc. Again, I will say something very soon about this claim, about this empirical evidence. Of course, this narrative has been successful also in the general public. This is a survey that was out also a few weeks ago. And this, for example, it shows that 90% of respondents, so like a very big majority, think that social media make easier misinformation to spread. So this narrative, I usually kind of summarize it in three main parts. So the first is that misinformation is abundant on social media. Misinformation has a relative advantage with respect to true information, like in the European Commission document, spread faster, deeper, and so on. And misinformation has an important effect on people behavior. So when people are exposed to misinformation, they may change their belief and possibly their behavior, like in the case of the infodemic associated to the pandemic. Now, in my talk, I will try to say that none of these is very robust, that from what we know, none of this point seems to be proven. And actually, we have some evidence for the opposite. So I will try to say that misinformation is limited. And, misinformation is limited, is often innocuous or mostly reinforce our pre-existing view. So it's very unlikely that this will have important effect. And then I will try to say why we are misinformed about this online misinformation, why this narrative is successful. And finally, I will try to discuss why I think that this narrative is actually harmful, is maybe a problem, and what we should do instead. As I was saying, it may be a little provocative, but I think it's important to discuss this kind of more general perspective. A very short introduction to this about myself. So as Emanuele was saying, I am a researcher in the field of cultural evolution. I cannot say anything about this, but we can talk about it later, or in case you are interested. And now, so 7 years ago, I started to use cultural evolution theories and cultural evolution methodologies to study the effect of digital and social media. And the idea, the ambition was, and still is, that it's important to have some background theory when we study digital dynamics. And at least at the time, my impression was that there were some nice studies that were maybe computationally sophisticated, that they use like data, but at the time, my impression was that at least some of these studies didn't have a particularly strong theoretical background in human behavior, in human cultural dynamics, and so on. So as I was saying, the ambition was that cultural evolution could provide this background, as I wrote with like a slogan in the book, like big data needs big theory, and the proposal is that cultural evolution could provide this. Okay, now let's go on the claims that I was saying before about the misinformation narrative. So the first one, that misinformation is abundant on social media. This, I think, is at least a problematic claim. So there are many studies, especially many recent studies, that show that when you consider all the information present in social media, or in general in the internet, the amount of misinformation is limited. So here I have just a few quotations. So 0.15% of Americans' daily media diet also is concentrated in specific users. So only 1% of individuals accounted for 80% of fake news exposures, and 0.1 accounted for 80% of sharing of fake news, according to the study. That's another study. They were trying to study fake news in Facebook, and they are saying like the vast majority of Facebook users in our data did not share any article in 2016 at all. Or the last one, this is a recent study for a group in Denmark, and they found that in their data, Twitter data, only 3% were related to news, and out of these 3%, only 4% were coming from suspect websites. So is the 4% of 3%. So again, we are at a number as 0 point something. So these, of course, are just some example, but I think that the literature is pretty, is very difficult, at least, to be sure that misinformation is so much diffused in social media when we take into account all the information. And the second claim, that misinformation has a relative advantage. So basically, every time that this is mentioned, there is the classic references, this Bouzougi and others paper in Science from 2018. And the claim in this paper are indeed pretty strong and I think surprising. So they say that false news reach more people than the truth, and the top 1% of false news reach 1,000 and 100,000 people, whereas the truth rarely diffused to more than 1,000 people. So that's a big difference. Falsehoods are 7% more likely to be retweeted than the truth, and falsehood also diffuse faster than the truth, like 6 times faster. These are like big claims if they are true. But like the idea already, when you see that the true news rarely diffused to more than 1,000 people, seems already quite surprising claim. You need some kind of strong evidence. And I think one problem with this study that was actually made clear also by the author, so I'm not saying nothing particularly new or controversial here, is that this result depends on how they sampled fake and true news. So what they did was to use fact-checking website. For example, Snopes is one of the ones that they used. So what happened in this website is that they take some problematic news and they check if they are false or true. So basically, their sample was made by these problematic news, and they called the fake news the one that were rated as false, and true news the one that they rated as true. But the problem is that there are the great majority of true news, and the great majority of true news that get extremely popular doesn't end up in fact-checking websites. So to use an example that is more or less contemporary to their analysis, the news that Trump was become president of US was the true news that was not in their sample and that clearly reached more than 1,000 persons. So one can reformulate the claim that they did in this paper and replace into fake news and true news, debunk the rumors and confirm rumors. But so this is an interesting result, but has not much to say about the general circulation of true and fake news. And since this article had such a big influence, it's good to be careful when we see this claim that misinformation is advantage in social media respect to true news, because we really don't have, I think, any strong evidence about that. And the third part of this claim, so that misinformation change people behavior, this is more partly, at least, about my work. So I will not enter in the detail, but in cultural evolution, probably the main topic that we study is social influence and social learning. And one of the basic idea in cultural evolution is that we are strategic social learners. So this, again, I cannot enter in the detail, but this is a famous model in cultural evolution that show basically that social learners are not advantage to individual learners if they don't use strategically their information. And so this has generated a lot of research in cultural evolution about what are usually called social learning strategies. So there are a lot of various rules that are used to decide when accepting new information, and especially if this new information is different from our the information that we already have. And I would go even a bit stronger than this. So this is part of my research. So many experiments in cultural evolution actually show that not only participants are strategic social learners, but actually that they discount social information, so they don't use social information enough. They don't use social information in this optimal strategic way. These are, again, few articles that appear and that show this phenomenon. And these are quite interesting because in all these articles, people were trying to test this optimal social learning theory, and what they found was kind of a surprising result for them, that participants were not using social information in an expected way. So like these players did not consistently use the social information in any way captured by our models. Considerable number of participants did not use social information. By the end of an experimental farm, only about 20% of participants chose to use social information. Biases for acquiring information individually rather than socially. Payoff bias, social learning. So one of these strategy is adaptive but underused. And in this case, we did a bit more. We did a proper systematic review of this experiment that was published last year. And we found that this seems to be a pretty strong effect. Like in this experiment, the one that we use in the review, the underuse of social information is 10 times more common than the optimal use or the overuse, which is quite rare. So the idea here is not only that we are strategic social learner, but that we actually it's very difficult that we change our mind when we are exposed to new information. So there are other evolutionary approaches to social learning, like epistemic vigilance. I advertised this very good book from Hugo Mercier, Not Born Yesterday. And the idea here is that the default state is to not accept new information, to not be socially influenced. And the idea that we have now is that the problem is not that we are too influenced by misinformation, that we are too gullible, but that we are not enough influenced by the true sources. The problem is not to be gullible, but actually to be too stubborn. So these are a bit the free claims, and I think, again, as I was saying, I don't think that there is much evidence for any of them. Of course, misinformation exists, but also in my work, I try to show that the misinformation is often, at least, simply innocuous. It's like engaging information. This is this is from a few years ago, but the situation didn't change. These are the top 10 fake news articles by Facebook engagement, I think in 2019 or 2018. As you see from these titles, they are not exactly like hidden political propaganda, but they are engaging in a way that can be strange for us, but they are engaging form of news, if you want. And the idea here that I try to develop is that again, starting from some theory in cultural evolution, that some content favors the success of narrative. So, for example, negative content is generally more appealing and more easy to keep in memory. We are more willing to share negative content than positive content, or various other threat-related information, disgust, and so on. And so the idea here is that misinformation, exactly because it's less constrained by reality than true information, can be built to exploit these attractive features. This doesn't need to be a conscious process, but in the process of cultural selection, what we have now, the successful misinformation will tend to have these cognitively attractive features. And so, for example, in the study that I did, we found that negative content in our sample of misinformation was 5 times more common than positive content. So misinformation tended to be negative, and this is something that make it on average more successful than positive content. So on one side, the limited, I think, success of misinformation can be linked to the fact that can exploit these cognitive features. So it's just some kind of engaging information. And also on the other side, this misinformation is in general not changing minds too much. So this is another recent study from the same people, the Danish group. And if you look at these plots, so what we would be interested here is the first line and the last line. So fake news of Republican tendency, and the last line is fake news of democratic tendency. It's a US study. And again, the first thing that you can see is that the sharing of fake news is quite limited with respect of the sharing of true news, which are the other 5 central lines. And also the point that I am trying to make is that is all related to the same political tendency. So some Republicans share Republican fake news, and a very small amount of Democrats share fake news of Democrat tendency. So they are just reinforcing their own view, and it's very difficult that we would observe some change in belief or behavior. So this is a bit the story that I'm trying to tell. Then one thing that people ask me when I try to tell the story, say, okay, but then this narrative of about online misinformation is itself a good example of misinformation. And I think this is true, and so it's interesting to understand why this narrative is successful. And this is some work that I did recently with Sasha Altei. And the idea here again is that, as I say just before, for misinformation in general, there are some content is more cognitively attractive. It tends to make some cultural traits to be more successful than others. And so we tested for this idea that online misinformation is a big threat, is a danger for democracy, what kind of other beliefs were associated with it. So this is a correlational experiment. So we cannot say that anything causes anything else, but we can say what goes together with the idea that misinformation is a big danger. And so we tested a few options, like a general negative bias toward new technologies, preference for simple explanation, preference for threat-related information, the perceived difficulty to spot misinformation. So if people think that they are not very good in distinguishing misinformation from true information. And finally, the third person effect, which is the belief that other people are gullible, so that people think that they are good to spot misinformation, but is a problem for other people. And these are the results I just want to show you quickly. So what we found is that the most robust association is with the, sorry, there is an helicopter passing in front of me. Okay, is the is the third person effect. So the idea that other people are particularly subject to misinformation. This seems to be the belief that is most strongly associated with the idea that online misinformation is a danger. And then when we started to think about this third person effect, it seems to be something that we could find in various other examples. So this is another survey. And so when you ask people how much of the information that you see on Facebook do you believe to be true, only 5% of the respondents say that they would believe that all or most of it is true. But then when you ask to the same person, do you think most people on Facebook, then the 81% of respondents say that are too quick to believe all or most of what they see. So again, you see this imbalance between what people think of themselves and what people think of others. And but this is the same survey that I showed you at the beginning, so where we saw that 90% of people think that social media make easier misinformation to spread in general. But when you ask about themselves, so when you ask to what extent does social media make the following easier for you, then a lot of people, the majority of people, say that for them make easier to find the information that they need, and very few in this case they say that made it harder. Of course, the questions are slightly different, but again, you see this imbalance when people think about themselves and when people think about the effect on the other. So we believe that this third person effect is related to the cultural success of this idea that misinformation online is a big threat. So to sum up and to go toward the conclusion, I think that there is no obvious support for misinformation being widespread online and more effective in spreading than true information. I think there is no obvious support for the idea that misinformation is very important in changing ideas and behaviors, but there are other options that explain the circulation, the limited, as I was saying, circulation of misinformation. So it can be just entertaining, like in my cognitive attractive hypothesis, or can just be there and reinforcing existing views. So in both cases, this misinformation is not changing people's mind. And then I presented you this other study in which we kind of find that there is an association between this third person effect and the belief that misinformation has a big impact and is very prevalent. The final question that I would say is that, I mean, why should we care? So in any case, we don't want misinformation to circulate. The best option would be zero misinformation. So let's keep on working on fighting misinformation, which I think is perfectly fine. But I also think that the narrative, the extreme success of this narrative that online misinformation is a threat is also problematic, can have other unwanted effect. One is that this kind of narrative is often used to restrict the freedom of press. So this is from The Economist, 2021, and show countries that explicitly passed fake news laws. So you see the usual suspect like Hungary or Russia or Brazil. And I mean, of course, it's not that the cause is the narrative about fake news, but the two things, they go probably together, and it's a way to reinforce possible restrictive law about freedom of press. Another problem of this narrative, I think, is that this narrative is linked as a minimum, but in this case, I think there are also some demonstrable causal effect is decline to the is linked to the decline in trust of politics, reliable source of news, institutions. This is a case from UK. Of course, in UK, a lot of other not great things happen, but this decline in trust in news is something generalized. Again, the misinformation narrative is not the only problem related to this. I don't want to give like a simplistic causal claims, but I think there is an interesting relationship. And finally, what I think is the most important point is that we have limited resources, and my idea is that misinformation provides an easy to conceptualize and ideally also easy to take a solution to big complex problem. And I think that these big complex problems have more deep causes in social and economical factors that we need to understand. It's very easy to say that, okay, if we stop misinformation on social media, if we control Twitter and Facebook, thing will get solved. But I think this is really a not very important aspect of the sum of the big social and political events that has been strongly related to misinformation. So I go back to this documentary, The Great Hack. I don't know if you saw it, but the main point of this documentary is to show that that basically Brexit was due to the Cambridge Analytica operation and to the fact that they were able basically to use these illegal means to trick people in voting pro-Brexit. Now, of course, Cambridge Analytica did something wrong, but the effect of this operation are again not clear, and probably I think is more important when we think about things like Brexit to think about real social and economical problem and not think about misinformation and Cambridge Analytica. And this is a quote from a review of the documentary from The Economist that kind of capture my feeling about it. So what I propose instead is that if as us probably we are interested in study social and digital media system, we should try to have a kind of broader approach. So not focusing on fighting misinformation, but we can, for example, also, I think it is more important to focus on increasing the trust in reliable news, or also on other aspects. We could focus on how to enhance the positive effects of social media interaction, which I think they exist and they are really not much studied at the moment. All the issues related to algorithms, for what is my interest in algorithm of presentation of information, this is also, I think, relatively understudied. So I would try to work in this direction. And then, of course, for big things like political events, I think we should instead focus on the problem themselves more than get stuck on our interest on social media. I'm concluding here. I don't know if I'm doing with the time. I will not in the detail of this. I just wanted to mention this individual-based model that we did and was strangely accepted in the Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review, because basically we are saying that would be again, I will not enter in the detail, but I'm happy to talk about it later. But our main claim is that given the disproportion between reliable information and misinformation in social media. So there is a very small amount of misinformation and a big amount of true information. If in our intervention we focus on making more acceptance of reliable information, the same effect that we can have, so improving the acceptance of reliable information versus decreasing the acceptance of misinformation, given that there are so many more reliable information, our intervention would be way more effective for the same increase versus decrease of acceptance. And so we try to develop a bit this idea in the model, and it seems pretty robust. So it's a sort of justification of what I was saying about focusing on improving acceptance of reliable news. And that is basically it. This is kind of a summary. So I do think that social media have a huge impact of production and communication of information. And so I think that we should keep on working on this and try to make the situation as better as possible. But I have a relatively strong opinion about the fact that keep on repeating that things are bad and that misinformation is spreading in the social media is not really strongly justified by research, but mostly is also not very, very productive and can also have some spillover drawbacks, like the thing I was talking before. And so in general, the idea would be that a broader focus on social media could be hopefully a more productive way forward. And yeah, that would be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberto, for your very interesting and, as you said, provocative talk. And we have time for questions. Also, we have also people attending on the WA platform. I was able to enter the platform at the end. So also people on the WA can write down question on the chat if they want, and people here in Zoom can just write the question or unmute and ask your question if you want. And remember that we have also time for in-depth discussion on the panel discussion at the end of all the presentation. So any question or comments from the people here in Zoom? Cannot see well the chat. So maybe I can break the ice because I mean, I'm really interested in your point of view on this narrative going on, and especially in relation with you told at the beginning of your presentation with this that is related to this general negativity bias towards technologies and this some techno panic that is going on. But then you show that when you check for this type of effect is not so high, but the third person effect is much higher. But do you still think that this techno panic is something the real in our society, or you just think that is an hypothesis that we do but is not checked?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I do think is real. In a way, I think is more. It seems to be more pushed by media than well accepted by people. Again, because then it's to me kind of surprising that people are all relatively happy to keep on using social media. So I mean, it's to me this seems to me a kind of a proof that people in the end or don't care too much, but I cannot believe that people are not able to say no to social media if they want to. This seems to me another of this strange idea or this addiction to technology, which are not very robust. So I think that it exists, is another kind of attractive idea, but is stronger probably as pushed by media that is real effect on people.
Thank you. And
Thank
so
you.
I will ask again if there are questions from people there. No question on what? So I do have another question.
Okay.
Because okay, when you talk about misinformation and this narrative, you relate it very much to fake news, but misinformation is more a more broadly phenomenon, related to echo chambers and spiraling of radicalization, or all these other types of that are not false amplifier networks and all this stuff. So do you think that this point of overstate is just about fake news, or is about the whole misinformation, disinformation phenomena in this ecosystemic sense?
If I have to say what I think, I do think that it's not just about fake news, but is in general about a lot of potentially dangerous phenomena related to social media and technology. So I also, in the case of algorithmic radicalization and echo chambers, I think they are clearly very interesting phenomena, and is good up to a point that we pay attention to this and that we try to understand what is going on. But I think that also there's been an aspect in which they started in the past year to be as I was saying, extremely like on the hot topics, and people started to find fake news spreading, presence of echo chambers. Then probably the next speakers, the various next speaker in this workshop will have different opinion, but that's a good thing. But for example, I think with respect to echo chambers, the literature now seems really different from the literature that we would have had a few years ago. It seems that the real there is like traditional media are way more polarized than social media. Algorithmic radicalization is something that we really don't know much about it, and when people do and try to study, it seems the effect of algorithms are not that strong as sometimes they are supposed to be. I mean, I'm not particularly optimistic in general about the future of the world. I just think that thinking and pointing at the social media as the causes of this problem is to me a sort of finding a technological fix to problem that are more depth and unfortunately probably more difficult to resolve than just finding some tricks in the functioning of social media.
Yeah. So thank you. I think we can keep discussing this on the panel discussion at the end, because you put on the table a lot of things to discuss. So thank you again, Alberto. And
thank you.
And if there are no questions from people there, we can